in wind tunnels. And I had the misfortune of living across from one when I lived in Columbus, and I went to Ohio State. I lived across the street from a wind tunnel, which they did not tell us when I bought that condo. And about every 20, 25 minutes during the summer, they'd crank this thing up, and it would sound like a hurricane coming through your neighborhood. And it'd last for about 30 seconds and then go away. But needless to say, with 2 toddlers, that was a little rough at nap time. So what they do in these wind tunnels is they crank up the air, and it flows super fast over an object. And maybe they'll trail some smoke through there. And they watch the profile that it follows as it goes around. It's slipstream. Okay. Well, what you're looking for when you do that kind of thing is you want that smoke to go in a nice line, go up and around and back down. You don't want it to swirl. Okay. If it swirls, that means the air has become turbulent. Instead of flowing in a nice straight laminar or linear fashion, now it starts to go all chaotic. And that's called turbulent flow. In all cases with fluid flow, if you speed up the flow rate high enough, you'll eventually get to the point where the friction between the container and the fluid is so great that now it starts making the fluid near the edge travel more slowly than the stuff in the middle, and that's what makes it become turbulent. The material in the middle travels straight, and the stuff on the edge where there's friction travels more slowly. We've all seen this in creeks. If you ever looked in a creek or a river that kind of gets a wide spot, maybe you've seen bees or something floating along in it. Out in the middle, they just float kind of straight along. But where they get near the edge, they start to tumble a little bit. Okay, and that's this idea of turbulent versus laminar flow. From a physiological standpoint, this is very, very important. Okay? And you don't have to write down anything right now because we'll talk about this when we talk about blood clotting, but we'll see who remembers this. I think I asked you before, what happens if blood just stands still? Okay? If you just take blood out and let it just stand still, it clots. It contains all the factors it needs to clot all on its own. If it stops flowing, blood will clot. Okay? And if it flows turbulently, it's more likely to clot than it is if it's flowing in a laminar fashion. So within the cardiovascular system, the name of the game is to maintain laminar flow whenever possible. We don't want turbulent flow. Turbulent flow is also quiet. You can't really hear it. And if you've ever ridden in a jet, okay, you know that a jet engine produces a lot of airflow and it's turbulent, okay, and that's why it's so loud. In fact, anytime we use a fan or something like that to move air, it's loud, it's noisy, because we're moving a lot of air very quickly and it's always turbulent when we do that. My wife kids her, she hates the sound of those fans, she really hates that, so she wishes I would invent a silent fan. And I keep telling her I don't think it's possible, but I guess I could give it a shot. If you want air to move quickly, it's always going to move turbulently. So it's always going to make noise. Water and blood are the same deal. When it moves fast, it makes noise. So turbulent flow is noisy, laminar flow is quiet. That I'd like you to know. Okay, that's something to remember. Turbulent flow is noisy, laminar flow is quiet. Ordinarily, we want to maximize laminar flow through our cardiovascular system. So should I be able to hear blood flow most of the time? No. If you move a stethoscope around in the body and try to listen to blood vessels, ideally you won't hear anything, because it should be moving in a laminar fashion. Sometimes we have a constriction in a blood vessel, and the blood has to flow very quickly through that constriction to keep flowing, and then it becomes noisy, and we hear it. And we'll talk about this in lab next week. That's called the week after. That's called a bruise sound, when you hear abnormal turbulent flow in a blood vessel. And it's usually a sign that there's some kind of constriction in that blood vessel, or you have abnormally high blood pressure. In the heart, however, we always have some turbulent flow because the valves slam shut. And when they do that, they cause turbulent flow of the blood in those canals. And we hear it. And that is what makes the heart sounds. Okay? It's turbulent blood flow through the valves as they close. That's what causes our heart sounds. In a normal cardiac cycle, the AV valves close first. And so that's called the first heart sound, or S1. Okay? So these valves here. In a normal cardiac cycle, where would a new cardiac cycle start its action potentials? We just talked about it in lab.
SA node.
In the SA node up here. Okay. And then they spread out through the left ventricle and right ventricle, and they make the ventricle. I didn't mean ventricle. I meant atria. I pointed to the atria, right? Through the left atria and right atria, and then they culminate down here where the AV node would be, and they go through the bundle his and the bundle branches and then down here. So the atria contract just before the ventricles. So what happens is, while the ventricles are relaxed from the previous cardiac cycle, blood flows from the atria down into the ventricles. So it actually happens during what we call diastole, the period where the ventricles are relaxed. The blood that is collected from the body or the lungs flows down into the ventricles during that period. Then the ventricles start to fill with blood. So they're filling passively at this point. Okay, the first 2/3 or so of ventricular filling occurs completely passively. It's just a result of the blood collecting in the atria, and then the ventricles relax, the pressure in the ventricles drops below the pressure in the atria, and blood flows in. In order for that to happen, the AV valves have to open, and that's silent, doesn't make any noise. Then the blood flows in, and then finally, as a result of that action potential in the SA node, the atria contract. And they don't contract with a lot of force, they just kind of go, and they kind of flatten their flaps a little bit. And that pushes some more of the blood down into the ventricles. But when we do that, when the atria contract and we push a little bit more blood into here, the ventricles expand, and just like blowing air in a balloon creates pressure in that balloon, if you fill the ventricles, you're gonna give it some pressure, right? Not a lot, but a little. You stretch the ventricle walls, and the pressure bumps up to about 5 millimeters of mercury. That increase in pressure is enough to make the AV valves close. Okay. So as a result of filling and a buildup of a small amount of pressure in the ventricles, the AV valves now try to fall backwards. The blood tries to go back into the atria. And when they do that, the AV valves close and they prevent backflow. Does that make sense? Okay. And now we know that the AV valves have a few adaptations to prevent them from falling backwards, which are those chordae tendineae connected to the papillary muscles. And now the ventricles are going to start contracting, and the papillary muscles tighten up a little bit so that the valves don't collapse backwards. That's called prolapse. When the valves go backwards, it's called prolapse. And when a valve goes backwards like that and prolapses, the generic term for that valve that's not functioning correctly is now, it's called an incompetent valve. Okay. Somebody calls you incompetent, I think we all know what that means. It's not a compliment. Okay. It means you're not doing your job. So a prolapsed valve specifically is one that has gone backwards, and that would be a type of incompetent valve, which would allow blood to go backwards, right, which we don't want to have happen. Blood going backwards is called regurgitation. If the blood flows backwards, it's called regurgitation. And regurgitating blood is going to do two things. One, it's going to lower the amount that's going forward, so it's going to lower your cardiac output, and it's going to increase turbulent flow. And turbulent flow increases your risk of clotting. And that really, in a mildly incompetent valve, is the real risk of death, is creating spurious blood clots, which are called thromboemboli. Okay, so let's assume our valve is not incompetent and it's functioning correctly. It closes. The closing of that valve can be heard, and it makes a lub sound. Lub. That's your first heart sound. It's called S1. Right? Lub. Now the blood is trapped where? After the lub. The blood is trapped in the ventricles. Okay. What we need now to do is to contract the ventricles, increase the pressure, and once the pressure in the ventricle goes up high enough that it's higher than the pressure in your arteries, which remember, the blood pressure in your arteries never drops to zero, right? As a result of the elasticity of our elastic arteries pushing on the blood, that's our diastolic pressure. Once our ventricles overcome the diastolic pressure, then that pushes the blood out, and it goes out to the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. And when it does that, the semilunar valves pop open. So this happens about halfway through systole.
That's called a reflex.
So halfway through systole, the ventricles get enough pressure that they pop open the semilunar valves and we eject blood. Okay? We continue to squish on the blood, it continues to eject for a little while, but eventually we're pushing on a smaller and smaller and smaller amount of blood. So that's called diminishing returns, right? You keep working on something, but what you're working on is giving you fewer and fewer rewards. So eventually the pressure starts to drop. Even though the ventricles are pushing on it, it's ejecting blood. So the pressure falls. And as the pressure falls, it eventually falls below the pressure in the arteries now. When that happens, the blood would want to sag backwards into the ventricles. So put it in motion up here. During systole, the ventricles contract, right and left. When they do that, now remember at this time these valves are closed, so we can't go back into the atria. So we need to eject the blood out this way. So the pressure in here rises until it's higher than the pressure in the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. Then we eject blood. These valves pop open, and blood goes out to the lungs, or this way, out to the aorta, left ventricle. These continue to contract, push the blood out. Eventually the pressure in here falls because we're ejecting blood. Once the pressure in the ventricles falls below the pressure in the arteries, either the pulmonary artery or the aorta, then these valves close because the blood tries to sag back into the ventricles and the valves close to stop that. And then that's actually what's responsible for maintaining your diastolic pressure as the arteries continue to squish on that bolus of blood we've ejected. Okay. So now we slam shut these semilunar valves, and that is your second heart sound. That's called S2. So S2 is a result of the end of the closing of the semilunar valves at the beginning of diastole. And usually S2 is described as the dub sound. So you have lub, dub. Now to someone who works with this for a while, they can train their ear to really hear these sounds and to actually even split them, okay? So for instance, S1 has an early and a late part to it. So it sounds silly when you enunciate it, but the lub, okay, the early S1 is the la and the late S1 is the ba. And for S2, the dub, early S2 is da and late S2 is ba. The reason that's important is because those actually represent the two different valves closing, okay? Generally speaking, okay, the atria and the ventricles are synchronized, meaning that the right and left atria contract together, right and left ventricles contract together. But there's a little, just like a couple of millisecond delay, not even a couple of milliseconds, part of a millisecond delay between the right and the left halves. And that's because the left half is just a little larger than the right half, it's more muscular, and it's a little farther away from the SA node. So it takes just a little longer for the action potentials to get to the left side than to the right side. So for that reason, the right side valves close just a little microsecond before the left side. So when we hear the sound lub, okay, the la is actually the right side valve closing, and the ba is the left side valve closing. Okay? They're pretty synchronized. I mean, lub, dub, those happen very quickly, right? But the sound is split just a little bit, so you can differentiate the early versus late. The early is the right side, late is the left side. Any questions about that? So S1 are the AV valves closing, and S2 are the semilunar valves closing. Early sound right, late sound left.
So S1 is AV, lubs, or AV?
Yeah, lub, that's the AV. Dub is the semilunar. That's S2. Now, somebody who's a good physician or a good clinician that's listened to a lot of hearts and practiced this, when they listen to the heart and they listen to the heart sounds, you know, rather than being lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, maybe what they get is a dub, a dub, a dub, a dub, a dub, something like that. Well, they're missing the la part from the first S1. What do you suppose that means?
The atrial ventricle, right atrial ventricle valve is not working.
Yeah, you both got it right. Yeah. So that would mean that the right AV valve is probably incompetent, right? And you're not hearing it because the blood flow is not turbulent, okay? Because it's not slamming shut properly. We call that a murmur. When you get an abnormal heart sound, that's called a murmur, and it's usually caused by a valve defect. There may be cases where the heart sound, instead of being lub dub, just sounds like dub 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 dub. That means you're missing all of S1. That's bad. That means that both your atrioventricular and pulmonic valves are malfunctioning. Okay. Well, actually, no. That would mean both the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are malfunctioning. You know, bad news. You can stay alive with a malfunctioning valve. It just, what's that?
Can't you like, or isn't that
You
painful
probably wouldn't
in a
feel it.
way, or-
No, you probably wouldn't feel it. You would be very fatigued, okay? If your left AV valve were truly incompetent, you would have very low cardiac output, and you'd be very, very lethargic, okay? However, valve defects by themselves usually don't kill you. The danger there is that you get chronic illness because your cardiac output goes down, and then that puts stress on things like your liver and your kidneys and your lungs, and you basically, it's a very poor quality of life. You may linger along for 20 years like that, okay? But eventually what's gonna kill you is blood clotting, okay? when the blood regurgitates like that, it tends to clot. And then you form clots, and the clots